The work was already costing me something I hadn't priced. I knew it the way you know a slow leak, not by the sound but by what goes missing. The color in my hands, some warmth behind my eyes. I kept painting anyway. There is a specific kind of woman who keeps going when she knows she should stop. I have been her my entire life. I thought I had finally learned better. I had not. If you've ever poured yourself into something or someone who didn't know what it was costing you, this one is for you. Stay with me. And if you find yourself here often with women like us in stories like this, the subscribe button is quiet and it's always there. The woman who hired me never met me in person. Her name was Adeline. She said it once on the phone, in the careful way people say things they expect you to remember, and everything after that was email. Formal sentences. Precise terms. 3 months payment deposited before I had signed anything, which should have made me suspicious, and instead made me say yes faster than I had said yes to anything in 2 years. I told myself it was the money. My hands were already reaching for my supply cases before I hung up. The estate sat on the Severn River, east of downtown Annapolis, at the end of a private road that the GPS did not know existed. I found it the way Adeline had described, past the boatyard, past the iron gate that was already open, down a gravel lane where the November trees had dropped everything and stood bare and exact against a white sky. The house was Federal period. 3 stories of red brick gone dark with age, white trim precise at every window, a fanlight above the front door that caught the thin morning sun and held it like something kept. It had the quality of a place that had been maintained rather than restored. No renovation smell, no fresh paint optimism. Just the particular stillness of a building that had been tended for a very long time by people who understood the difference between repair and change. I sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary. The water below the bluff was the color of old iron. A woman named Sable opened the door before I knocked. 40s, unhurried, with the kind of watchful quiet that is not unfriendliness but something else, assessment, maybe. She looked at me the way you look at a problem you have not decided is solvable yet. She showed me to the studio without small talk, which I appreciated. The room was large, north-facing, stone-floored. 2 long work tables. Good overhead height. A bank of windows that looked out over the bluff toward the river, admitting a clean, directionless light. The kind painters call honest, because it doesn't flatter anything. My eyes moved to the windows before anything else, the way they always do, calibrating. No east exposure. No south. Nothing that would admit direct sun at any hour. I noted this. Filed it. The room smelled like old linseed oil, stone dust, and underneath both, something I couldn't immediately place. Sweet, but not food sweet. Old, but not decay. Like a word in a language I had studied once and mostly forgotten. I was still trying to name it when he walked in. He did not announce himself. He did not hesitate at the doorway or navigate. He simply moved through the space, as though the space had long ago agreed to arrange itself around him. His bearing was the particular kind that is not performed. You cannot practice that quality into yourself. You can only arrive at it after enough time has stripped everything softer away. His eyes were white, not clouded, white, the way marble is white, with a depth to them that made no sense if you thought about it directly. I did not think about it directly. He stopped at the center of the room. He did not look at me. The gesture was reflex, the eyes moving toward the sound of my presence and then going still. He said, in a voice that had been flat for so long it had worn grooves into the flatness. What makes you think you can give me something I don't already have a word for? No introduction. No pretense of one. I had worked with difficult clients. I had worked with difficult men. I had worked with difficult men who were also clients, which is its own specific discipline, and I had learned that the most important thing you can do in the first 30 seconds is refuse to perform the discomfort they are handing you. I haven't given you anything yet, I said. A pause. Brief. 2 seconds, maybe 3. He turned and left the room. I worked until the light through the north windows went gray. The first canvas was saffron mixed into gesso, fine sand from the Spa Creek shoreline worked into the wet surface while it was still taking impressions, layers of amber pigment building up from cool base to warm peak the way light actually accumulates in an afternoon sky. Not placed, not painted on top, but grown from underneath. I used my fingers more than the brush. The texture had to mean something to the touch. It had to carry temperature. I left it on the central table and did not wait to see if he returned. The drive back across the Severn Bridge took 11 minutes. I parked at the house on Spa Creek, my mother's house, still, and stood at the kitchen sink washing cadmium yellow from my hands, watching the water run clear. The color of my skin underneath was wrong. Not the gray of exhaustion. Not the waxy look that comes from skipping meals. Something more particular. A shade too pale, too even, like the February light off the river when the sun is up but has no warmth in it yet. Like the first layer of color had been lifted away and what remained was still functional, still present, just less saturated than it had been that morning. I stood there looking at my hands for longer than made sense. Then I went and made dinner. Checked my email. Made a note to bring more saffron tomorrow. I told myself the light in the kitchen was bad. My hands knew better. I ignored them. I had driven back across the Severn that morning telling myself the hands were nothing. Bad light in the kitchen. Low iron. The kind of thing you explain away when the alternative requires more attention than you have to spare. By the time I reached the estate, I had almost believed it. The canvas was on the floor. Not dropped. Not fallen from the table in the night. It had been placed, face down on the stone with the deliberate care of someone making a point they do not intend to argue. The back of the stretcher faced up, raw wood and staples, and there was something obscene about seeing it that way. Like finding a letter opened and left on the counter. The violation was in the precision of it. Casper was already in the room, standing at the far end with his back to the upturned canvas. His posture did not invite a response. His posture was the response. I set my bag down. I did not pick up the canvas. Not yet. I stood inside the room's particular quiet, that sweet beneath stone smell again, and underneath my own coat the November cold I had carried in from outside, and I looked at the back of a man who had placed my work face down on the floor and then positioned himself so he would not have to acknowledge that he had done it. I had been here before. Not this room, not this man, but the specific geometry of it, the deliberate slight, and the performance of indifference. I had lived inside that shape for years of my life. My hands knew it before my mind did. I breathed out slowly through my nose and said nothing. It smells like a market stall. His voice came, without preamble, still facing away. The texture, if you want to call it that, feels like bad taxidermy. Something preserved after the fact rather than made. He turned then, not toward me but toward the center of the room, the way a man turns when he is addressing a space rather than a person. I have had 4 artists before you. Every one of them believed that texture was a shortcut to feeling. That if you made a surface interesting enough, the emotion would follow. A pause. They were all wrong. You are using the same shortcut. The room was very still. My jaw had tightened in the specific way it tightens when I am deciding not to say the first thing that comes to me. I crossed to the canvas on the floor. I crouched and took its edge and lifted it. There was a soft scrape against the stone as it came up, a sound like something reluctant, like something that had gotten used to being where it was, and I carried it to the table and set it face up without looking at it. Then I turned back to the room. He was still standing with that flat posture, that air of a verdict already rendered, and I looked at the line of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of a man who has spent centuries learning to wait out discomfort. And I said, not looking at him, "Then tell me what a sunset smelled like." A beat. Before. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight to it, a particular density, like air before a pressure change. I kept my eyes on the canvas in front of me, the saffron still vivid under the surface despite the face-down night on the cold floor. Before what?
His voice had changed.
Not softened, narrowed. like a man asking a question he already knows the answer to and is deciding whether to be angry about it. I looked up. Before you couldn't see one. He left. He moved past me toward the door with that same unhesitating command of the space, and I stood at the work table and did not watch him go. I listened to his footsteps on the stone, measured, deliberate, not fast, and then the sound of the corridor receiving him. The door did not close. I heard him stop. 1 second.
2.
3. I was counting, though I could not have told you why, except that the pause had meaning, and I wanted to know its length. He stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when a room is this quiet, and then his footsteps resumed down the corridor and were gone. I stood there. The canvas in front of me had a scuff on the upper left corner, where the stone had taken something from the surface. A small wound. I ran my thumb across it and felt the grit embedded in the pigment, sand from Spa Creek, still present, still holding. The fury came up slowly, the way real fury does. Not the hot flash of it, but the slower, deeper kind, the kind that settles in behind the sternum and sits there, patient, waiting to be dealt with. For artists before me, all wrong, all using shortcuts. He had delivered this information the way a man delivers a conclusion he has held for long enough that it has become fact, and every cell in my body wanted to pack my supply cases and drive back across the bridge and call Audioline and explain that the commission was not going to work out. I did not do this. I mixed a new ground layer instead, pulled out the raw umber and began working it into the surface over the scuff, rebuilding what the floor had taken. My hands moved through the familiar sequence, thin coat, long strokes, working with the grain, and the fury sat behind my sternum, and I let it sit there. What I did not do was examine what was beneath it. 3 years since I had been this focused on a problem. 3 years since a room had felt this charged with something worth solving. The fury was real. The fury was also, and I would not think this clearly until much later, driving home as the last light came off the Severn in long cold pieces, not the whole of what I was feeling. He had asked before what in the voice of a man who knew exactly what, who had simply never had anyone say it to him directly before. I worked until the light shifted. I did not think about the question again until I noticed, washing up at the sink an hour later, that the pallor in my hands had moved another inch toward my wrists. I stopped checking my hands in the morning. Not because the pallor had stopped advancing, it hadn't, but because looking at it before I drove to the estate had begun to affect the quality of my work, and the work was the only thing I was not willing to compromise. So I started keeping my eyes up when I washed my face. I made coffee. I loaded the car. I told myself that whatever was happening would still be happening whether I monitored it or not, and that was true, and it did not help as much as I wanted it to. A week in. 6 canvases made. 4 of them gone in various ways. Overturned, dragged, removed by Sable in the night like evidence of something she had been asked to make disappear. I did not ask her about the last one. She returned it to my workspace at the Spa Creek house with no note, and I set it against the wall and looked at it for a while, and then made a 7th. The 2 he had not touched stayed on the table. I had noticed and noticed that I noticed the way he entered the room differently on the mornings both were present. Not gently. He was not gentle. But there was a fraction of a second at the threshold, a pause so brief it might have been nothing, and I had begun to time my own arrival around it the way you adjust your step to avoid a board creak. Quietly, without admitting to myself why. He started asking questions on the 4th day. Not about color. I had been waiting for questions about color, had prepared for them, had thought through how to translate hue into temperature and saturation into weight. Those questions did not come. He asked how a brush felt when it was fully loaded with pigment, whether the weight of it changed the way the arm moved, or whether the arm moved first and the brush followed. He asked whether pressure varied by intent, whether the mark you made when you were certain felt different in the hand from the mark you made when you were working something out. I answered carefully. The loaded brush is heavier than it looks, I told him, on a morning when the river outside had gone flat and silver under cloud cover. You feel it in the wrist before the elbow. When the paint is thick enough, the brush wants to drag rather than glide. You have to decide whether to fight that or use it. He was standing 6 feet away, facing the north windows. He did not turn. And when you are uncertain, he said, the mark is different. It wasn't a question. The mark is always different when you're uncertain, I said. You can see it in the texture. Too much pressure, or not enough. The body gives it away. He was quiet for a moment. The cloud light through the windows was even and without warmth, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's waiting. Yes, he said. It does. He left before I could answer. I stood there with my brush in my hand and the particular sensation of a conversation that had been about something other than what it appeared to be, and I turned back to the canvas and did not think about it too carefully, because thinking about it carefully would have required me to admit that I had been answering both questions he was asking, the one about painting and the one he would never ask directly. The good work started on the 5th day and did not stop. That is the only way I know to describe it. Good work. The specific kind, where the decisions come before the thinking, and the thinking comes after to find out what the decisions meant. It does not happen often. When it does, time goes strange. The light through the north windows cycled from white to gray to the particular blue-gray of late afternoon, and I did not mark any of it, because the canvas was alive, and I was inside it, and nothing else was real enough to compete. The room smelled like cinnamon. I had worked dried spice into the newest ground and stone, and the sweet underneath everything that I had been smelling since the first morning and had not yet named. I was naming it now. Slowly. The way you name something you have known for a while, but kept calling by the wrong word. The light went charcoal. I did not notice. He came in without sound, or rather, the sound of him was so familiar by then that my body registered it and decided not to interrupt what my hands were doing. His footsteps. The particular displacement of air that meant he had entered a room. I processed these things and kept working, my back to the door, my eyes on the surface in front of me where the layers were finally doing what I had been trying to make them do for a week. He did not speak. He crossed to the table. I heard it in his footsteps, the angle of them, the distance, and stopped. And then I heard his hand on the canvas. A drag. Slow, deliberate. The pad of his fingers reading the surface the way you read a page in the dark, not looking for beauty, looking for meaning. The sound was so small. Just skin against texture, the slight friction of it, and underneath that the faint give of the layered pigment. I had never heard my own work touched before. Not like that. Not with that much attention. I stopped breathing. I did not turn around. I have been watching difficult men for most of my adult life. Men who perform indifference, men who use stillness as a weapon, men who have learned to keep their faces arranged into something unreadable because readability once cost them something they could not afford. I know that face. I know its architecture. It is not the same as the face of someone who is not moved. I turned my head, slowly, just enough. His face was turned down toward the canvas. His hand was still moving, small increments, a careful geography. His expression was not arranged into anything. It was open in the way a face is open when the person wearing it does not know anyone is watching. I should have said something. Cleared my throat. Made a sound. I did not. I stood in the half-dark of the studio with the cinnamon smell around me and the charcoal light coming off the river outside, and I watched his face while he touched the thing I had made, and I knew, even then I knew, that I would spend a long time afterward deciding whether what I had done was a theft or an offering. What I know now is that it was neither. It was the first true thing that had happened in that room, and we were both inside it, and neither of us had chosen it. That is usually how the true things go. The true things, I have learned, do not wait for you to be ready. I had gone to bed the night before with the studio still present in my body, the cinnamon smell in my hair, the particular ache in my right wrist that comes from a long session, the image of his face turned down toward the canvas sitting somewhere behind my eyes where I could not look at it directly and could not stop seeing it. I slept badly. Not the restless kind of badly, the too still kind, where the body goes under completely and the mind follows and you wake up feeling like something happened while you were gone that nobody is going to tell you about. I looked at my hands before I remembered I had stopped doing that. The pallor had moved past my wrists. I stood at the bathroom mirror for a long time. The woman looking back was not ill. That was the first thing I checked for, and the first thing I ruled out, not the gray of fever, not the particular hollowness around the eyes that comes with something wrong in the blood. She looked like a woman who had been working very hard in a room with no direct sun. She looked like February, like a color that had been mixed correctly but applied too thinly, so the ground showed through. I pressed 2 fingers to the inside of my wrist and felt my pulse, steady and present. Translating, I thought. The word came from nowhere and settled like it belonged. I did not know what it meant exactly. I knew it was accurate. I drove to the estate anyway. The bridge over the Severn was doing what it does on clear November mornings, throwing the light around in ways that make the water look molten at the edges, cold at the center, a combination that has no name in any color system I have ever worked with. I watched it through the windshield and my hands tightened on the wheel, not from fear but from the old reflex, the need to get back to a canvas before the specific quality of a specific light was gone. Some things do not wait. Sable did not meet me at the door. The estate was quieter than usual, a quality of quiet that felt intentional, like a room someone had prepared. I walked the corridor to the studio and stopped at the threshold. Casper was at the window. Not the work table. The window, the wide north-facing glass that looked out over the bluff to the harbor below. He was standing close enough that the cold coming off the pane would have been on his face, and he was turned toward it with the stillness of a man who has been standing in one place long enough that the standing has become something other than waiting. The water below was catching the late sun and throwing it back in long, flat pieces. Gold, not the warm gold of summer. Not the decorative kind. The heavy kind. The kind that looks like it has been somewhere and come back changed. He could not see any of it. He stood there anyway. The way you stand at the grave of someone you are not finished grieving. I should have set my bag down. Started working. Let him have whatever this was in private, the same way I should have made a sound 3 nights ago in the dark studio when his hand was on my canvas. I said, without deciding to, "It's gold today." The water. Not the pretty kind, the heavy kind. Like it's carrying something. He went very still. Then he turned from the window. Toward me. His white eyes found the direction of my voice with that precision I had stopped being unsettled by, and he did not speak, and the silence was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of a man who has been handed something he was not prepared to receive, and is deciding whether to put it down or hold it. I kept going. I described it badly at first. The harbor. The sailboats moored along the city dock. The way the masts caught the low sun and made thin shadows on the water. The Naval Academy chapel dome going from white to amber in the afternoon shift. The words were the obvious words. The postcard words. I heard them coming out of my mouth and felt the inadequacy of them, the way you feel the inadequacy of a translation that has the right words in the wrong order. I stopped. Breathed. Started again from a different place. The light was doing something complicated above the sailboats. I said. I don't have a word for it. I only have the color. It was the color a flame goes right before it changes, when it's still orange but there's something blue trying to come through underneath. The water directly below it was darker than the sky, by 3 shades. 4, maybe. The kind of dark that is not absence, it's depth. The light was sitting on top of it the way heat sits on a road. He had not moved. Not his hands. Not his weight from one foot to the other. He stood facing me with those still white eyes, and I had the sensation, unmistakable, the kind you cannot argue yourself out of being listened to by someone for whom listening was an act of will. Not passive. Not polite. Deliberate. Like every word I was saying mattered to the composition of the air between us. I could feel my own voice in my throat, the vibration of it. I had not been conscious of that in years, the physical fact of speech, the way it uses the body. When I stopped, the room held the silence for a moment. Then, again. Quiet. Not a command, a request, which from him was a different thing entirely. I described it again. Differently this time, not better, not worse, but from another angle, the way you walk around a thing you are trying to understand. I found words I had not used the first time. I lost others. The chapel dome became the line where stone meets sky becomes the place where your eye stops knowing what it's looking at. The water's darkness became the weight of what is below the surface pressing up against the light from underneath. He listened to all of it. I knew, while I was speaking, that I should stop and tell him about my hands, about the wrists, about the word translating that had come to me in the bathroom mirror and settled like a diagnosis. I knew the responsible thing, and I kept describing the harbor instead, kept finding new angles, kept offering the light to someone standing 3 feet from a window he could not see through, and the cold coming off the glass reached me from across the room, and my voice stayed steady, and I did not stop. I did not stop because he was listening. That, in the end, was the whole of it. He listened to me describe the harbor twice, and then he said goodnight and left the room, and I stood at the cold window for a while after he was gone with the feeling of someone who has been mid-sentence when the conversation ended. I drove home, ate something I could not afterward remember, sat at the kitchen table in my mother's house with my hands in my lap, the spa creaked dark outside the window, and I thought about what it had felt like to be listened to that way, not evaluated, not assessed, not waited out. Listened to. The whole body of me had been present in that room in a way it had not been present anywhere in a very long time, and that was the fact I kept circling without landing on because landing on it would have required me to know what to do with it, and I did not. I went to bed. I was careful not to look at my hands. He was already in the studio when I arrived the next morning. Not at the window. Not standing at the threshold of the room performing indifference. He was at the work table, facing the largest canvas, the one he had not destroyed, the one that had been on the table since the first week, with his hands at his sides and his head slightly inclined, the posture of a man in the middle of a decision. I set my bag down quietly. He said, without turning, "I want to hold the brush." Not may I. Not I was wondering. The sentence was stripped to its fact, the way all his sentences were, and underneath the flatness of it was something I recognized only because I had been watching his face for weeks by then, the particular quality of a person asking for something they have been deciding whether to ask for long enough that the asking has become its own kind of cost. I crossed to the supply table, took the wide flat brush, the one I used for ground layers, the one with the most presence in the hand, carried it to him handle first. He took it without moving toward me. His fingers closed around the handle and he went still, and then he began to turn it, slowly, the way he had moved across the canvases, the way he read everything, with his whole attention running through his hands. He tested the weight at different points along the handle. He found the balance. He pressed his thumb very gently against the heel of the bristles, and I watched his face register the give of them, the way they yielded and sprang back, with an expression I had no category for. Not wonder. Something older than wonder. The face of someone recognizing a grammar they had believed they would never be allowed to use. "Load it," he said. I took it from him. Mixed ground, raw umber, fluid enough to move, but with enough body to hold a mark. Loaded the brush fully, the bristles dark and heavy with it, and placed it back in his hand. He felt the difference immediately. The weight of it, the slight change in balance. His wrist made a small adjustment. "Guide my hand to the canvas," he said. I placed my hand over his. 1 second, that was all, just long enough to move his arm the correct distance, to bring the loaded bristles to the surface of the canvas, and his hand was colder than I had expected. Not the cold of a room. Not the cold of someone who has been standing at a window. A deeper cold. Steadier. The kind of cold that has been a long time settling into a body and has no intention of leaving. I positioned the brush against the canvas and stepped back. His first mark was too hard. The bristles dragged, wood pulling through the pigment instead of the hair gliding over it, and the line came out torn at the edges, overworked, the paint piling where it should have laid flat. "Too much pressure," I said. "The brush wants to move on its own. Let it." He lifted the brush. Reset. The second mark was uncertain. I could see the uncertainty in it, the slight hesitation where the pressure had wavered, but it was a mark. Real, present, made from intention rather than habit. Darker on one end where the brush had landed, fading as the pigment released, and beside it a slightly lighter line where he had made a second pass without being told to, trying something out. I did not say anything. I watched his face. He was not trying to look like he didn't care anymore. That was the whole of it, that single change. The arrangement was gone. Whatever he had spent centuries keeping in place across his expression, he had stopped spending it, and what was underneath was not softness exactly, but presence. The face of someone who is here, in this room, at this canvas, in this specific moment, without the barrier of performed indifference between himself and the fact of it. When he stopped, he stood very still, brush in hand, and said, "I don't know what I made." I looked at the canvas. 2 marks, one torn and overworked, one uncertain but true. A dark stroke and beside it a lighter one, like something in the process of deciding whether to emerge. "Something that didn't exist before," I said. "That's usually what it is." He did not move away from the canvas. We were standing close, the distance you stand when you are both looking at the same small thing, and the studio held its particular stillness around us, cinnamon and stone and the cold flat light off the November river, and I was aware of all of it the way you are aware of your own breathing when you have remembered to notice it. I was losing color by the day. I knew this. The pallor was past my wrists. My reflection that morning had been a woman I recognized less than the one from the week before. I had stood at the mirror and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, this is what it costs, and I had not turned away from it, and I had come anyway, and I was here now, standing at a canvas with a man who had just made his first 2 marks, and the thing I could not afford was already too far along to pretend I hadn't let it happen. I picked up a second brush, loaded it, held it out to him. "Here," I said. "Put the next one here." I touched a point on the canvas, to the left of his second mark, where the composition needed weight. "Lighter this time, like you're not sure yet." His hand found mine on the canvas surface before I could move it away. Not holding, just a moment of contact, his fingers over mine on the textured ground, cold and steady, and I did not pull back, and he did not either, and we stood there for one breath with the harbor gray outside and the marks he had made between us, and I understood that I had stopped being careful some time ago without noticing exactly when. I showed him where to put the next mark. December came in overnight. I felt it before I saw it, the particular quality of cold that is not autumn anymore, that has crossed some threshold in the night and arrived at something more final. The Spa Creek house held it in the walls, in the floors, in a way the old windows let the outside press closer than they should. I had been in my mother's house for 3 years, and I still had not replaced the windows. I dressed slowly that morning. My hands had gone past pale into something else, a translucence, faint but real, as though the skin had thinned by one layer. I could see the blue of the veins at my wrists more clearly than I had been able to a month ago. I stood at the mirror and looked at this for a measured moment, and then I picked up my keys and drove to the estate. I was not going to tell him today. That was what I had decided on the bridge, watching the Severn iron gray beneath a sky the color of unprimed canvas. I was going to go in, continue the work, show him where to put the next marks. There was more to teach. There was always more. I had been telling myself this for 2 weeks, and I had almost made it true. He was standing in the studio doorway. Not inside the room. Not at the window or the work table. In the doorway, blocking it, without the quality of someone who had forgotten to move. He had positioned himself there. His face was turned toward the corridor, toward the sound of my approach, and when I stopped in front of him I understood before he spoke that whatever I had decided on the bridge was not going to hold. His expression was not the flat arrangement I had come to read as his default. It was not cold, not dismissive, not the practiced blankness of a man who has survived centuries by refusing to let anything land. It was the face of someone who has been sitting with a realization long enough that it has stopped being a shock and become a weight, present, acknowledged, not going anywhere. He said, "You're giving me your light." Not a question. Not an accusation. A fact he was handing me to confirm or correct, spoken in the voice of someone who did not need confirmation. The corridor was very quiet. Outside, Somewhere beyond the estate walls, a gull called once and went silent.
How do you know? I said.
Also not a question. Because every canvas has more than texture. He paused. There is something in them that is not pigment and not sand and not saffron. It has been in every one you have made since the beginning, and it is lessening in you. I can hear it, in your voice, the way the breath sits differently in it now. In the way you move through a room. You are lighter than you were. He said, lighter the way you say a word you have been weighing carefully before using. I did not deny it. There was nothing in me that wanted to. I sat down on the studio floor. Not dramatically, my body simply made the decision before I did, the way the body does when it has been making allowances for fatigue long enough that it stops asking permission. I sat with my back against the cold stone wall and my legs in front of me, and I looked at the canvases arranged around the room. The ones he had not destroyed, 9 of them now, and his 2 marks on the 10th, and I breathed. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat beside me. I had not expected this. I had not expected any version of this. The man who had swept my first canvas to the floor and stood with his back to it, sitting down on cold stone because I was sitting on cold stone, close enough that the temperature of him reached my arm through my sleeve. I looked at the wall across from us and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what was happening by trying to name it. Outside, the harbor was the gray of deep December. The Severn light was flat and particular, the kind of light that does not suggest anything. It simply is, present and without agenda, the last light before the year gives up trying. I started to describe it. The water today is not today. His voice was quiet, not cutting me off, making space for something else. Today I want to tell you what I remember. The stillness that followed was the deepest the studio had held since I had started working in it. Then he spoke. He described a sunset from 1743, the Chesapeake, late September, when he had been standing at the waterline of what is now the Maryland shore, and the light had been doing what light does in that window between summer and autumn when it has lost its height and found its angle. He said the water changed color at the waterline first. Deep orange, not the orange of paint, he said, but something underneath orange, something that orange was built on top of. It pulled upward through the surface in degrees he did not have names for. The clouds were moving ahead of it, he said, racing the light or being raced by it. He could never decide which. The sky behind them was a color he had called red for 300 years because red was the closest word, but he knew, and had always known, that red was not it. He described it slowly, without performance. The way a man describes something he has carried for a very long time in a place where no one could ask him about it. I listened. I did not reach for a brush. I did not look for the color in my mind's palette or try to translate it into ground and pigment. I just listened, the stone cold against my back, his voice low and even beside me, and the harbor outside going darker by degrees as the morning wore on toward a noon that would bring no warmth with it. When he finished, the room held the silence for a long moment. Something had returned behind my eyes. Not much, not the full measure of what the weeks had taken. A thin warmth. The way a room feels when a window has been opened just enough to let the outside in without letting the cold take over. I sat with it carefully, the way you sit with something you are not sure will stay. He reached out his hand, palm up, waiting. I placed mine in it. His fingers closed, cold, steady, the same cold I had felt through his grip on the brush, and we sat against the wall with the December harbor outside and the canvases around us, and the 2 marks he had made on the 10th canvas visible from where I sat, dark and uncertain and real. I haven't used the word light in 300 years, he said. I used darkness as its substitute. I told myself they were the same thing. A pause. They are not the same thing. I thought about that on the drive home. About substitutes. About the things we use in place of what we cannot have, for long enough that we forget what we were replacing. There are other women in this city. I have sensed them, in the way a painter senses when someone else is looking at the same subject from a different angle, the slight interference in the light. Women who came here for one reason, and found themselves staying for another, who gave something away that was not listed in any agreement. We do not compare notes.
We do not need to.
We know. If something in this story reached you, if you recognized her, even a little, you're not alone in that. There are women in this channel who understand what it means to give your light to someone who didn't know they were taking it. If you don't want to lose this feeling, the subscribe button keeps you here. This is where those stories live.